Hi, my name's Javen, and my family erased me. Not with words, but with silence, with omissions. With a smile while selling the house I restored with my own hands. They held meetings I wasn't invited to. Toasted legacies I wasn't part of. And worst of all, they used my name on papers I never signed. They called me the broke one. But the land they built their image on, it was mine. So why did they lie? Why did no one stop it? And what happens when the forgotten one owns everything? Stay with me, because this story isn't about revenge. It's about memory and power. The last time I pulled into the circular driveway of the family estate, it was to carry my grandfather's ashes inside. Today, the house looked like it had forgotten all of that, like it had scrubbed off any trace of loss, of reality. Spotless hedges, imported orchids, a banner across the columns, celebrating 40 years of Thaddeus and Lynette Keller. Everyone in tuxedos and gowns, everyone performing joy. I stepped out of my dusty gray pickup and let the valet blink at it for a second too long before handing over the keys. My navy blazer wasn't wrinkled, but it sure didn't scream legacy or luxury. I'd worn it to my last real estate closing. Nothing flashy, just tailored enough to feel like armor. I adjusted my sleeves as I walked up the limestone steps. The sounds of laughter floated out through the glass doors. Cassidy greeted me before I could get past the foyer. "Javen, you made it. I honestly thought you'd have a delivery route tonight." She tilted her head with that syrupy smile that always felt 1 degree from contempt. "I rearranged some things," I said with a nod. Behind her, my brother Thaddeus strolled over. His handshake was brief, barely a squeeze. "Glad you could find the time. We've got a great crowd today. Folks from the firm, investors, even the mayor dropped in." I didn't say much. It was clear I hadn't been missed until my absence risked making someone else look bad. Dinner was served in the main ballroom. The chandeliers glowed like something from a wedding magazine, and every place card had been embossed in gold. I found mine at the end of one of the side tables, close to the kitchen doors, far from the head of the room. After dessert, the slideshow began. A voiceover narrated the highlights, celebrating the legacy of the Keller family. First up, Thaddeus. Photo after photo of ribbon cuttings, groundbreaking ceremonies, magazine covers. Then Cassidy, beaming beside her fundraising totals and podcast thumbnails, Brad's Ivy League graduation, Victoria's plastic surgery award. Even Moraine, though less flashy, had her medical volunteer work featured. Then came my slide. A grainy picture from a family reunion 5 years ago. My name spelled Kellen. No title, no caption. Just a photo of me in a t-shirt holding a paper plate. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Someone cleared their throat. The slideshow moved on. My mother didn't flinch. The rest of the night didn't try to fix it. Over coffee, Thaddeus launched into a monologue about a $12 million land deal he'd just closed near the Outer Banks. "We're talking pre-approval on zoning, private beach access, boutique build-outs by Q3. "Impressive," someone said. "Exponential," said another. No one asked what I'd been up to. Brad, now 2 beers deep, leaned toward me and grinned. "Uncle Javen, when's your next Uber shift? Still rocking the dented truck?" Laughter followed. Even Cassidy couldn't hide her smirk. I raised my mug, smiled slightly. Still gets me where I need to go. They didn't know that truck had delivered contracts worth more than some of their leases, but saying that would have made me look petty. And in this family, silence often passed for humility, at least when you had no clout. I excused myself after a while, stepping out to the back patio. The air smelled like roses and chlorine. From here, the estate looked like a photo in a real estate brochure. Every angle, curated. Every imperfection hidden. I remembered scrubbing those floors when Grandpa was too sick to walk. Running to the pharmacy at midnight when he needed something the nurse forgot. Back then, this house was heavy with memory. Now it was hollow with ambition. They'd turned my refuge into a showroom. When I re-entered through the side hallway, most of the crowd had moved into the lounge for nightcaps. I passed the dessert table and caught a glimpse of a new poster pinned beside the family tree chart. My name was at the bottom. Smaller font, no image, no mention of what I did. They didn't erase me, they just reduced me until it felt polite. I stared at that tree for a full minute, my breath shallow. No anger, just clarity. I whispered to myself, so this is how they see me. But I wasn't going to let them keep dancing on a foundation I built. After that poster moment, I returned to the dining room because, well, that's what you do in this family. You show up, you smile, you eat the dessert, you pretend like things didn't sting. I found my seat again at the far end of the table, just as the staff began clearing the last of the entrees and bringing out plates of triple-layer chocolate cake. The conversation was back to its normal rhythm. Stock options, Aspen real estate, a private kindergarten that apparently had a wait list longer than a congressional term. No one made eye contact with me, not even in passing. I sipped water and counted ceiling tiles. Cassidy leaned in toward her side of the table, voice just loud enough to carry. Lake Tahoe this year was magical. We rented the Kelman estate. Oh, the one with the helipad. I knew that trip. I'd seen it on Moraine's Instagram months ago, a carefully curated photo of them all on paddleboards. I hadn't been invited. Not even an afterthought. Thaddeus chimed in. We're considering Greece next summer, or maybe Montauk. Depends on the market. I cleared my throat lightly, trying to interject. Actually, I read an article about emerging beachfront investments. Could be... Before I could finish, Victoria smoothly cut in. You know who has a Montauk connection? James Altman. His wife's cousin owns property right on the cliffside. And just like that, the spotlight shifted. My voice folded back into the linens, unnoticed. As the plates were replaced with espresso cups and petit fours, the topic turned to Victoria's engagement party. She'd gotten engaged 2 weeks prior to some hedge fund wunderkind I hadn't met. The excitement at the table was tangible. Brad raised his glass. So, Victoria, where's the big event happening? She giggled. Oh, it's perfect. Classic and meaningful. We're hosting it at the old Hollis place. Something in me stopped. The old Hollis place? Our grandparents' estate? They didn't know. I blinked, set my fork down. That estate had come on the market in a quiet sale months ago. I had bought it through a holding company, Everpine Trust. I'd been fixing the roof, redoing the landscape, even preserved the original oakwood banisters. And they were planning to throw a party there without even consulting me. Worse, they hadn't even known I was the owner. Would be nice, Brad added loudly, if Javen could get a date and time for the party. You bringing anyone, man? Or just your truck? Another round of laughter, casual but sharp. I chuckled politely. We'll see if the truck behaves itself that day. The laughter faded, and someone moved on to a conversation about caviar varieties. I remained quiet, looking around at these people, my blood, my supposed kin, clinking glasses inside a home they didn't know was mine. I excused myself again, walking out through the side door into the garden. The air had that post-rain clarity, and the scent of rosemary floated in the breeze. The same rosemary I'd personally planted when restoring the back terrace. I leaned on the railing, watching the lights flicker on upstairs. The bridal suite, I assumed. I'd repainted that entire floor by hand. Spent hours making sure the crown molding matched the original design. Now they were decorating it for a party that would likely erase me from even the thank you speeches. They didn't know what they were standing on. They had no idea. I wasn't sure if I wanted revenge, but I was sure of one thing. I was tired of pretending like I wasn't here, tired of being the ghost in my own house, tired of hearing my name used like a punchline. Inside, the music swelled. Someone turned on a speaker in the living room. Classic Sinatra. My Way. Fitting. I watched the windows from where I stood, yellow light dancing behind the curtains. And then, softly, I whispered, "They don't even know what they're standing on." That was the moment I decided not just to remember, but to reclaim. The next morning I woke before the sun. My room, still tucked into the back corner of the estate, felt colder than usual. I pulled on a hoodie, slid into sneakers, and made my way downstairs. No one else was up. That suited me just fine. I wandered through the hallways, letting my footsteps echo against the hardwood floors. The portraits lining the walls stared back with blank expressions. Men in stiff suits, women in pearls, frozen in time. Most of them didn't even know my name when they were alive. Eventually, I found myself outside the old study. I paused, hand on the knob, then pushed the door open. It still smelled the same, like cedar, leather, and the faint trace of my grandfather's aftershave. I took a slow breath. This was the room where I used to read to him when his vision started to fade. I slept on a cot in the corner for months during his last year, taking shifts with hospice nurses, learning how to inject insulin and change dressings no one else wanted to deal with. I sat in his old chair, ran my fingers along the edge of the desk. 2 years ago, I learned I'd been removed from the preliminary ownership documents for the estate. Not a phone call, not even a heads up. Just a revised draft emailed to Moraine that I'd accidentally been CC'd on. My name wasn't there. I called Thaddeus. He answered like he was late for something. "It was just a clerical shuffle," he said. "You don't even live there now." He hung up before I could ask what else they'd shuffled. Back then, I let it go. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I didn't want to become another family story whispered about in rooms like this one. But now, after last night, after hearing my own property used as a party venue without so much as a nod my way, I realized I hadn't let it go. I'd just let it settle deeper, and it was starting to rot. The study was dim, morning light only now beginning to peek through the curtains. I stood and walked out through the garden door, letting the screen swing shut behind me. The air was crisp, dew clinging to every leaf and blade of grass. I walked past the hydrangeas, the small pond Grandpa had dug himself, and made my way to the tool shed near the far fence line. Inside, I found John. John was in his 70s now. He retired when Grandpa passed, but he still came by once or twice a week, claiming the place needed real hands. I always suspected he just didn't know how to let go of this land either. He looked up from a rake and gave me a crooked smile. "Didn't think you'd be up this early." "Didn't sleep much," I replied, stepping inside. He dusted off his gloves. "You've been quiet." I shrugged. "Habit." John nodded slowly. After a pause, he said, "They told me to clear out your room the day after the will was read. Said to turn it into storage." I said nothing. The words settled somewhere low in my stomach. "They said you'd moved on, didn't need the space anymore." I nodded. Of course they did. He looked at me, his eyes tired but kind. "Your grandfather never would have let that happen." We stood in silence for a while before I left. I walked back toward the house, but stopped at the oak tree halfway up the hill. That tree had been here since before I was born. Grandpa used to sit under it with a paperback in one hand and iced tea in the other, swearing he got his best ideas right there in the shade. I sat down at the base, let my back rest against the bark. His voice came back in fragments. You'll never need to prove yourself if you know where you stand. That's what he'd told me one summer afternoon, watching me struggle to hammer together a birdhouse. I took out my phone, scrolled to the folder labeled Legacy Docs. Inside, every piece of paper they thought I didn't have. Property deeds, LLC formations, purchase agreements, tax records, bank statements, every signature filed, every date logged, every asset protected. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I whispered, "Let's remind them who really remembers this place." That warning wasn't a bluff. It was a trigger. At exactly 8:47 a.m., my phone buzzed with a message from Cassidy. 9 sharp in the library. It's about the estate. No emojis, no good morning. Just business. Cold, clipped, and painfully familiar. I stared at the screen for a second too long, letting the weight of those 10 words settle in my chest. Cassidy never contacted me directly, unless it was a photo op or a formality she couldn't delegate. This wasn't casual. This was orchestration. I made my way down the hallway, passing framed photos I'd dusted once, years ago, when they still let me help with upkeep. Now they just served as reminders of who got a spotlight and who got cropped out. The library was already full when I walked in. Everyone had taken their seats in the same unspoken hierarchy that dictated where you stood in this family. Thaddeus was standing near the fireplace, posture locked and voice already mid-sentence. "We've agreed to move forward with the developer. Papers will be reviewed tomorrow. Sale can close within 60 days, he announced, like he was reading quarterly earnings. I stepped inside slowly. "We?" He didn't turn. "You weren't part of the investor group, Javen." I moved closer. "No one asked me to be." He glanced at me now, and his mouth twitched into something resembling a smirk. "You don't live here. Haven't in years. We assumed you'd moved on." Cassidy chimed in from the couch, legs crossed, fingers resting delicately on a glass of cucumber water. "Honestly, Javen, you've lived here rent-free for years. If anyone should be grateful, it's you. Not disruptive." A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. One cousin coughed into her elbow. Moraine gave me a look that said, "Don't." But I wasn't swallowing this one. I stepped forward. "I've paid for more in this house than most of you realize," I said evenly. "The roof, my bank account, the sprinkler system, my install, the landscaping you all love taking Christmas photos in. I paid the first 3 years of property taxes when no one else stepped up. I was here, when it mattered." Thaddeus raised his eyebrows but didn't flinch. "There were no contracts, Javen. You did what you did out of affection, I assume. But affection isn't equity." "No," I said, "but neither is erasure." Cassidy snorted. "Erasure? Come on, no one's trying to erase you. You're not being excluded. You just haven't participated." "Because I wasn't told," I replied. Barnett Crowe, the family attorney, sat to the right of Thaddeus, scribbling something in his yellow legal pad. But I caught the glance he threw at me, a flicker of tension beneath his always neutral face. He knew. He always knew. Moraine finally spoke up. "We should at least acknowledge that this affects Javen too." Cassidy waved her off. "This affects everyone, Moraine. Let's not turn this into an emotional roundtable." I looked around the room. So many familiar faces, none of them familiar anymore. "Let me be clear," I said, turning to face Thaddeus directly. "If you move forward without me, don't be surprised if I stop playing by your rules." He tilted his head. "Is that a threat?" "No," I said, voice even. "It's a boundary." The room went quiet. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out of the library, not fast, not slow, just deliberate. Each step a decision, each breath a withdrawal from a system that had never accounted for me. That moment wasn't just a line drawn in the dust. It was a warning carved in stone. I didn't plan on forgiveness anymore. I was preparing for reckoning. When I stepped out of the library, I didn't wait to see how Thaddeus would spin my words. I didn't care if Cassidy huffed or if Barnett scratched something nervously into his legal pad. I was done watching their responses. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to earn a seat. I was building my own. The hallway outside was quiet, save for the soft tap of Moraine's heels catching up behind me. "That was bold," she whispered, catching her breath. "But be careful. They're not the kind to take kindly to challenges." I gave her a nod and kept moving. My jaw was tight, not from anger, but from the pressure of something long compressed now trying to surface. Around 4 p.m., I was out on the back porch. The sun was dropping behind the trees, casting everything in a soft gold haze. I was halfway through a cup of coffee when Cassidy found me again, this time with a different script. She smiled like we were co-stars in some old sitcom. "Hey," she began, voice honey-sweet. "Since you're not on the guest list for tonight's investor dinner, maybe you could help out a little? Greet guests as they arrive? Make sure valet runs smooth?" She held a clipboard in one hand, her diamond rings catching every last drop of sunlight. I looked at her, really looked. Cassidy didn't see me. Not truly. She saw a role she could assign, a space she could fill with someone who wouldn't challenge her timeline. I set my cup down slowly. "If this is your way of thanking me for letting you throw a party on my land," I said calmly, "you're doing a terrible job." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "You're excused." And I walked right past her, not even giving her the benefit of eye contact. The main house was buzzing. Waitstaff shuffled through with trays of crystal glasses. The entry hall was roped off with a velvet cord. I saw Brad checking place settings in the dining room. "Only for contributors," Thaddeus had said when Moraine asked if I was attending. I wasn't offended. I was focused. Instead of joining them, I took my dinner alone in the kitchen. Cold roast chicken, lukewarm potatoes. One of the servers recognized me and offered a smile. "You want me to bring this out to the porch?" "No," I said. "This is perfect." I sat at the prep counter, the same one I'd used to prepare Grandpa's meals when he could no longer chew well. I ate in silence, only the soft clink of utensils and the hum of the old refrigerator keeping me company. I remembered something Grandpa once said while we were sanding down an old bench together. "They'll never hand you a seat, Javen. You build your own table, then you make damn sure it's steady." That memory hit harder than the wine I hadn't been offered tonight. After the dishes were done and the laughter from the dining room started to fade, I made my way upstairs. The hallway was empty now, the distant sound of jazz floating up from downstairs. Back in my room, I pulled open the drawer beneath the desk. Inside was my leather folio. Inside the folio, my future. Property deeds, trust documents, signed and notarized LLC records, holdings quietly built over the last 7 years, things no one knew about, assets they never bothered to ask if I had. I laid them out across the desk in order. Everpine Trust, Hawthorne Street Holdings, Silver Ridge DevCo. I stared at the logos, the clean fonts, the subtle design choices. All mine, all legal, all earned. They'd ignored me for so long, they'd mistaken my silence for nothingness. They weren't just wrong. They were trespassing. I slid the documents back into the folio, zipped it shut, and stood. Looking out the window toward the party tent in the yard, I whispered to no one but myself. Let's see how they like the view from the other side of the table. They buried my name. I'll bury their illusion. The gravel crunched under my tires as I left the estate behind. I didn't say goodbye, didn't look back. 20 minutes north into the mountains, the road turned narrow and wound between trees older than our family's money. At the top sat a modest cabin with no cable, no internet, and no cell reception unless you stood by the chimney. My sanctuary. My archive. Inside, the air was cool and clean. I flicked on a single desk lamp and unlocked the cedar chest in the corner. Beneath the fleece blanket and metal flashlight sat the leather-bound folio, black, thick, and zipped tight like a secret kept too long. I carried it to the table, took a slow breath, and opened it. The first document was a deed, then another, then dozens more. Stamped, notarized, recorded, property after property. Townhomes in Asheville, a storefront in Winston-Salem, an entire duplex block in Greensboro. 8 years of calculated moves, no flash, no attention, all under shell companies I controlled. And there it was, the Keller estate, the house they planned to sell without me, the land they thought they still owned, filed under Everpine Trust, LLC. I flipped further. Ownership records, capital injection statements, transfer logs. They thought they were investors. No, they were just playing on the board I built. I murmured into the quiet. They think I'm just bitter. They've no idea I've been busy. Then I pulled out another folder, one I hadn't looked at in months. Inside was a scanned copy of a co-ownership agreement, originally drafted when Grandpa was still alive. It named me as a contingent stakeholder in the estate. A footnote, but a real one. Except, this version didn't have my name. I narrowed my eyes. It wasn't a formatting issue. It wasn't an update. It was a deliberate revision. Dated 6 months after Grandpa's funeral, filed through Thaddeus's firm. At the back of the file was a single-page addendum, a temporary transfer of rights from me to Thaddeus's development company. My signature was at the bottom. Only it wasn't mine. I leaned back in my chair. No emotion. Just stillness. Then slowly, I turned to the cabinet behind me and retrieved the original signature I'd filed on earlier estate documents. Not even close. He'd forged it. He hadn't just erased me. He'd robbed me. This wasn't just some cold shoulder or family shade. It was theft. Legal theft. The kind only someone born into privilege thinks they can get away with. I started sorting documents into piles. Red folder for asset ownership, blue for legal discrepancies, yellow for communications with my lawyer. My fingers moved fast, my mind faster. They didn't just cut me out. They defrauded me out of something I'd built, protected, inherited, not from money, but from presence. They took my silence for surrender. But I was never silent. I was documenting. When the folio was sorted, I packed it into a steel case and slid it under the passenger seat of my truck. Then I typed out a short email to my attorney and saved it as a draft. The subject line read, "Estate intervention, documents enclosed." Finally, I took out the very last paper in the folio. The deed. Bold lettering, center of the page. Owner, Everpine Trust, LLC, my entity, my name. I stared at it, then folded it slowly and returned it to its slot. "Let's bring the house down," I whispered, piece by piece. By sunrise, I wasn't just armed with evidence, I was done with mercy. Sunday morning, I parked by the South Drive and walked the gravel path up to the estate. The sky was pale, cloudless. A cool wind cut through the hem of my jacket. No one saw me enter. That was the point. I didn't need a seat at the table to hear what they were plotting over it. Thaddeus was hosting a private investor luncheon in the sunroom from the hallway. Behind the French doors, I stood silently, just out of view. The voices inside carried easily through the open windows. "So the new branding will highlight family lineage and entrepreneurial consistency," Cassidy's voice rang out, polished and rehearsed. "We're emphasizing strong ties and shared values." Thaddeus added, "Which is why we need to be careful who's featured. Weak links can tank perception." There was a hum of approval. Then the sound of a whiteboard being wheeled in. "Let's just be honest," Cassidy continued. "This isn't personal, it's strategic." I tilted my head to get a look through the cracked door. The board had names ranked from top to bottom. Cassidy, Thaddeus, Brad near the top. My name sat at the bottom, circled in red. Next to it, limited influence, non-contributor. Barnett Crowe, the family attorney, gave a half-hearted cough. "We need to keep the public image tight. Optics, you know." Another voice I didn't recognize said, "Maybe don't include him in any of the press shots at the estate transfer event." I leaned back, breath steady. I should have been angry. Instead, I was surgical, calm, focused, because now it was beyond repair. That evening, I walked into my room in the West Wing, the one they generously let me stay in. It had always felt off, like walking into someone else's idea of what my life should look like. I was adjusting the ceiling fan when I noticed it, a faint glint above the blades, a tiny black device tucked into the fixture. I climbed onto the desk, unscrewed the casing carefully, and pulled it free. A hidden camera. It wasn't part of the home's old security system. This was newer, sleeker, wireless, intentional. It had no markings, no tags, just a quiet, blinking red light. I snapped a photo and slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket. They weren't just keeping me out, they were watching me. I sat at the edge of the bed, holding the device in my palm. The weight of it felt heavier than metal. This wasn't about bruised pride anymore. This was surveillance, covert recording, legal lines crossed without a blink. I opened my phone and typed a message to Moraine. It was short, coded. "Everpine files ready by 10 a.m. tomorrow." She would know what that meant. Downstairs, the sound of laughter echoed faintly. They were pouring wine, clinking glasses, talking strategy and stock options, blissfully unaware of the storm forming one floor above. I turned to the suitcase I'd brought with me and laid out the folders one by one. Fraud, asset transfer, contract interference, surveillance evidence, each one labeled, cross-indexed, and ready. On top of the final folder, I placed a printed screenshot of that whiteboard, my name crossed out in red. Barnett's face was barely visible in the corner of the frame, looking directly at it. No one could pretend anymore. I reached for the camera again and held it up to eye level. "Let's see how you like being under the lens," I whispered. The house is silent except for the sound of my folder clicking shut. Monday morning arrived gray and windless. Even the estate's birds seemed to hold their breath. By 10 o'clock, every key family member had gathered in the formal conference room. The heavy oak doors were closed. No one laughed. No one glanced my way. Thaddeus stood near the fireplace, arms crossed in that posture he reserved for winning. "Let's finalize the paperwork on the property transfer," he said to the room, like a CEO addressing shareholders. Barnett, already seated, began handing out manila folders, one by one, each stamped neatly with Keller Estate Asset Transfer. Cassidy flipped hers open with the grace of a debutante opening fan mail. No one noticed that I hadn't reached for mine. I stood. "Before we sign anything," I said, my voice clear but measured, "I'd like 5 minutes to present something." Thaddeus sighed, a man tired of distractions. "Now's not the time for objections, Javen." Cassidy, not bothering to lower her voice, whispered across to Brad, "Here comes the annual speech." I ignored them both and walked calmly to the front of the room. I placed a black binder on the table, thicker than any of their folders, and flipped it open. The first page was a deed. "Everpine Trust, LLC," I said, tapping the document. "That's me." A pause followed, then a slow wave of murmurs. Brad squinted. "Wait, isn't that the LLC that bought the estate last year?" Moraine's lips twitched into a barely suppressed smile. Barnett's hand froze above his legal pad. Cassidy narrowed her eyes. "What game are you playing?" "No game," I said. "Just facts. This estate, every inch of it, was purchased by Everpine Trust. I've owned it for over 9 months. Quietly, legally." Thaddeus laughed once, dry and tight. "Impossible." I slid another sheet across the table. Wire transfer logs, notarized contracts, bank confirmations. Cassidy leaned forward, face paling. "Where did you even get the funds?" "Years of investing, years of being underestimated, and one mistake, when someone accidentally forwarded me an internal email meant for Thaddeus." I pulled that email from the folder, printed, highlighted. It detailed their strategy to bury the deed's value, ensuring I remained unaware of the estate's pending transfer. "You tried to hide the truth from me," I said, voice low. "That part failed." Barnett cleared his throat. "We may need to pause proceedings." I turned back toward the room. "I'm not evicting anyone," I said. "But this house, it's no longer your pawn. You all wanted me erased from the legacy. Now I'm the one holding the pen." A few faces looked down. Brad didn't blink. Cassidy turned red. "Thaddeus?" Thaddeus was still. Finally, even he had no words. The only sound was the soft snap of my folder as I closed it. That silence. It wasn't defeat. It was realization. The next morning, the house felt different. Not just quiet. Hollow. There was no arguing over espresso machines, no calls echoing from the upstairs office, no laughter rehearsed for the hallway. Even the walls seemed to exhale. I passed through the front corridor toward the east garden. Moraine was already there, standing by the fountain with her phone pressed to her ear, voice low, expression unreadable. Her other hand traced the rim of the stone like she was grounding herself in something older than this mess. The gravel crunched under my steps, but she didn't turn. We both needed our silences. Inside, the air hung heavier, not with tension but with what came after, the vacuum of pretense that used to hum through every gathering. No one looked at me. No one asked questions. In the dining room, I paused. Thaddeus was murmuring to Cassidy just beyond the archway, half hidden behind a column. "He's not part of the circle anymore, never was," he said, like he was brushing lint off his cuff. I didn't move. Cassidy replied without missing a beat. "We'll keep him out of everything moving forward, rebrand if we have to. He'll fade. People like him always do." I stood in the next room and heard every syllable. The insult didn't sting. The fact it came so effortlessly, that did. Later that day, I walked into the business planning room, what used to be Grandpa's den. The massive whiteboard stretched across the far wall, filled with color-coded lines and legacy projections. My name was gone. Not just absent. Erased, clean, like it had never been there. In its place, a red note. Asset anomaly. Exclude from PR scope. I stood there a long time, hands in my pockets, staring at the gap where I used to be. "You can't erase what built the foundation," I whispered. But I was lying to myself. Because it wasn't the erasure that hurt most. It was the silence. The absence of any voice objecting. No one asked why. No one wondered aloud where I went. Just clean removal, footsteps behind me. Moraine. "They may have erased you from the board, Javen," she said gently. "But they can't rewrite what you own." She walked over to the table and placed something beside me. A photo. Faded, but intact. Grandpa and I, kneeling in the soil outside the garden shed, hands muddy, laughter frozen in motion. I was maybe 14. He was wearing his straw hat and an old flannel shirt. "This," Moraine said softly, "is what matters." I said nothing, but my fingers curled around the edge of the frame. That garden was still mine. That memory still breathed beneath every square foot of this land. I turned to the whiteboard again. Then, without a word, I pulled the diagram from the wall. Rolled it up slowly. "Let's see how well their narrative holds up," I said, "when the house they're selling isn't even theirs anymore." I whisper, 60 days. Then the house goes with or without you." That was no threat. It was the last grace I had to give. The estate was quieter now, but not from peace. It was a new kind of quiet, one filled with tight jaws and darting eyes. The smugness had drained from their postures. No more choreographed brunches or impromptu toasts, just small talk layered with caution. But what struck me most, still, was the lack of apology. They couldn't meet my gaze, but not one of them had uttered a word that resembled sorry. I sat by the parlor window that afternoon, watching the sky darken. A storm rolled in from the Blue Ridge, distant thunder barely audible. Inside me, another front was gathering. The folder rested open in my lap. Thaddeus's signature stood at the bottom of a loan agreement. Bold, careless. He'd used a shell corporation to secure a short-term development bridge loan. I remembered the LLC name instantly. It was one of mine now. He hadn't noticed the transfer, probably buried in a tangle of late filings and automatic renewals. But the chain of control had shifted. Legally, quietly. I owned the paper he built his latest tower on, and he hadn't paid in 3 months. Interest had accrued, and I intended to collect. I typed out the document line by line. Notice of accrued interest, 60 days remaining. I printed it on thick, watermarked stock and sealed it in a beige envelope. There was no drama, no monologue, just math. That evening, I found them in the drawing room. Barnett sat in his usual corner nursing a bourbon. Cassidy hovered near the fireplace arranging hydrangeas in a vase like she hadn't lost a war 2 days ago. Thaddeus sat rigid, pretending to read. I handed the envelope to Barnett. He accepted it with the kind of hesitation usually reserved for subpoenas. Cassidy grabbed it before he could open it, tore the seal with one nail, and scanned the header. Her lips parted, then pressed into a line. Thaddeus looked up. "You can't do this," he muttered. I kept my hands in my pockets. "I already did." Silence. The kind that made even the antique clock hesitate. That night, back in my room, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched since my mother passed. Inside was a letter. Grandpa's handwriting unmistakable, slanted and deliberate. My mother had given it to me after the last meeting, saying he'd asked her to deliver it when the time was right. "Javen, don't let them convince you the land means less just because you didn't inherit it their way. You lived it. That's the difference. That's what counts. The roots know who watered them." Grandpa read it twice, then once more, slower. Outside, the rain had begun to fall. The next morning, whispers stirred. I didn't have to say anything. The town said it for me. People noticed when Thaddeus's car was towed from the Keller office lot. A legal repossession filed under my LLC. Moraine texted me mid-morning. "Brad's trying to spin it. Says it's a restructuring, but it's not working. They know." I didn't reply. Instead, I sat on the porch steps with Grandpa's letter in one hand and the clock ticking toward a deadline. 60 days. And then the land went with or without them. Ahead of me, a life no longer waiting for their permission. The estate looked exactly the same. The trimmed hedges, the gold-knobbed double doors, the echo of shoes on the marble entry. None of that changed. But something inside had shifted. No one said it aloud, but we were living in a fractured glass palace. One crack away from shattering. Meals were quiet now. Even the clinking of silverware sounded forced. Conversation stopped when I entered a room. I'd catch Barnett adjusting his collar, Brad checking his phone like there was something more important than the air we all now tiptoed through. Cassidy had packed up and left 2 days ago, citing a need to help her sister. Thaddeus stayed in town, making himself visible but unreachable. Rumor was he rented a condo near the old Keller Realty office. I didn't ask. I didn't care. What I didn't expect was the soft knock on my door that morning. Lynette. She entered slowly, carrying something in her hands. For a long minute, she said nothing. Just sat in the chair across from me, the one Grandpa always used to read in. I should have said something, she whispered finally. That day in the meeting. I should have defended you. I didn't speak. Not right away. It's not about defending, I said. It's about seeing. She placed a photograph on the table between us. Me, maybe 15, holding Grandpa's hand in the garden. Both of us covered in soil, laughing at something neither of us could remember now. The photo had a crease down the middle, like it had been folded, forgotten, and recently unfolded again. I see now, she said quietly. I really do. I nodded once. That was enough. Brad called that afternoon, left a voicemail too long, too wordy, trying too hard. Phrases like miscommunication and family first tangled with insincerity. I didn't call back. Barnett sent a letter, formal apology on Keller letterhead, carefully written, coldly safe. It arrived with no return address. Moraine stopped by midweek. They'll never admit it, she said while sipping coffee. But they know. Every one of them knows. I didn't need them to admit anything. I wasn't collecting apologies. I was clearing space. Later, I returned to the room with the whiteboard, the one where my name had been erased. The wall was bare now, just remnants of old tape marks. I hung a new sheet. Everpine Legacy, protected by honor. It wasn't about ego anymore. It was about claiming space, about declaring a boundary, that I was no longer to be edited out of the story. As dusk settled, I stood in the front doorway, looking out at the long gravel path leading away from the estate. The porch light clicked on behind me. I didn't turn. Behind me, a house that had survived the storm. Ahead of me, something more honest. I stepped forward. Some stories don't end with forgiveness. They end with freedom. The 60-day mark came quietly. No fanfare, no showdown. Just a date circled in red on my calendar and the sound of a moving truck idling at the base of the estate's driveway. Thaddeus hadn't paid. He hadn't called. Not a single email, not even a delegate sent to bargain. He just vanished into his silence, as if it could buy him more time. I sat on the porch steps with a mug of black coffee, the early morning fog licking at the front lawn. I watched as movers unlatched the truck, their breath visible in the chill. One of them gave me a nod. I nodded back. No need for explanation. They had a job to do. So did I. Mid-morning, I drove into town. The records office smelled like dust and old printer ink. The notary on duty barely looked up as I placed the file folder down. Inside, deed transfer, default clause execution, lien confirmation. Everything documented, stamped, signed. The clerk scanned the documents and frowned. "They'll fight this," she said. I nodded. Let them. Back at the estate, news spread like ink on wet paper. The local paper ran a soft headline. Prominent family faces estate dispute. But it was the online chatter that carved deepest. Forums buzzed, comments racked up. Turns out the heir they mocked owned the roof over their heads. Guess legacy doesn't like being humbled. Brad tried to spin it, called it an internal reorganization. His video got more dislikes than views. Even his smile cracked on camera. The biggest twist, though, came that afternoon. Thaddeus stood at the estate gate, hands in his coat pockets. He didn't buzz, just waited until I opened it. "You've made your point," he said. "What do you want now?" I motioned him towards the garden. We walked past the shed Grandpa and I once rebuilt, now half covered in ivy. "I want what was mine," I said. "What I bled for. What you mocked." He didn't argue, just looked around, as if seeing it for the first time. "So it's revenge?" "No," I said. "It's restoration." At the garden bench, I handed him a printed judgment. Every asset now tied to my trust, including the lease on his office downtown. "You have 30 days to vacate," I added. He read the paper. Once. Twice. Looked at me like a man realizing the room he'd built was never his to begin with. But he didn't say a word. And I didn't need him to. Later that evening, I stood near the bench Grandpa once called his thinking spot. The air was still. A few amber leaves danced across the gravel. In my pocket, the letter. The one he left me. The one that reminded me the land had always known who cared for it. I breathed. For the first time, I didn't wait for someone to acknowledge me. The family legacy didn't die. It just finally changed hands. Some stories don't end with fireworks or applause. They end with quiet clarity. And if there's one thing I've learned through all this, it's this. The power to reclaim your story doesn't come from loud revenge, but from silent truth. You don't always get justice the way you expected. Sometimes you just get a chance to walk away holding your name with dignity intact. And that's more than enough. I spent years waiting for a seat at a table that was never built for me. What they forgot is, you don't need permission to build your own. If you've ever felt erased, underestimated, or written off by the very people who should have stood by you, know this. You are not alone, and your worth doesn't require their recognition to exist. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Or maybe the one who sacrificed quietly while others took the spotlight? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Drop a 1 if this story hit home, or let me know where you're tuning in from. And if this video didn't land with you, tell me why. I'm listening. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you feel even just a little more seen, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this coming. Stories of grit, quiet strength, and the kind of healing that takes time, but lasts a lifetime.